second half of chapter 15 deals now with the efferent nervous system, right? With the motor output coming from both conscious and subconscious thought in the brain. And particularly here, we're focusing in on the somatic nervous system, which means the effector, where this signal is going to, is skeletal muscle, right? So we're looking at the motor output of the brain in how it tells skeletal muscles what to do, okay? In chapter 16, again, we'll deal more with the autonomic nervous system. When we look at how information is passed from the motor cortex, right? And again, here we have another motor homunculus. This is telling us basically how much motor control we have. Again, you'll notice things like the hand is quite large, right? Or the tongue is big. Those are going to have very small motor units, very precise control. Where things like the quadricep, even though it's a huge muscle, the motor homunculus here is telling us that it's kind of gross motor control, large motor control, rather than fine. As we look at how this sensory information is going from the cortex out to the skeletal muscle, right, we have a slightly different setup in our pathways here. We're going to have what we call an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron, right? So on the sensory side, we had first, second, and third order. Here, as far as somatic nervous system motor output, somatic nervous system has an upper motor neuron, right? And this is going to be located in the primary motor cortex. Right? Again, thinking back to our previous chapter, notice the detail here. They're actually putting those cell bodies here in that precentral gyrus, right? That was the site of this primary motor cortex. Again, because this is in the cortex, we know that it is conscious thought. Voluntary actions are taking place here. It is going to synapse with the lower motor neuron, either in the brainstem or the spinal cord, right? This lower motor neuron then, the cell body is in the brainstem or spinal cord, and it is going to be the neuron that's actually reaching out to skeletal muscle, the neuron that is innervating that motor unit. Okay, so maybe a little simpler than the sensory side of things. We'll come back and talk about autonomic in chapter 16. Okay, so we have three pathways: the corticospinal, the lateral, and the medial. And again, these don't tell you much. Corticospinal has some clues, right? That this is going from the cortex to the spinal cord, right? So you would know that this is a motor pathway. So let's take a look at these three. Again, the clue here is that it's cortex towards the spine, so it's going to be carrying motor output. This is what carries voluntary, right, again, from the cortex, voluntary control of skeletal muscle. And so we had this picture, again, of the motor homunculus looking at that primary motor cortex. The cell bodies are all in that cortex and then sending their information down to the brainstem or spinal cord. Again, we see this decussation, so that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Again, unknown reason why that's happening. Again, details that help us think through previous chapters, right? Remember in the spinal cord, we were looking at our gray matter here, our little butterfly. Notice that that lower motor neuron is actually leaving from that anterior gray horn, right? They're making these very anatomically correct, hopefully, to drill that message home for you. So the upper, I guess I can put that, the upper motor neuron is in the cortex. Again, the primary motor cortex. That's how we know it's under voluntary control. That lower motor neuron is leaving from the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, right, and going out to the skeletal muscles. Okay, we won't belabor that. The medial pathway, and again, don't worry about getting into these individual tracts unless you're super fascinated by it. The book does go into more detail. What I want you to know with the medial pathway is that it does things like gross movements of the trunk and the proximal limbs, right? So the upper arm, the upper leg. So gross movement of the proximal limbs. If that's not going to make sense to you when you come back to your notes, upper arm, upper leg, and the trunk, right, is the main thing I want you to understand about that medial pathway, right? It is involved in things like posture, balance, muscle tone, but really doing those bigger movements, right? When I go to write on the board, I still need this portion of my arm to move, even though the precise control is going to be in my hand. So the upper limb information is coming there from this medial pathway. The lateral pathway, okay, is going to be carrying information, the precise movement of the distal limbs. Right, so those are definitely working together, right? So those are our three motor, somatic motor pathways. Again, the pathway is this idea of how does the action potential get from the source out to, in this case, the motor unit. Okay, a couple final somatic motor concepts here, or regions. The basal nuclei. So again, we talked about these a little bit when we were in, was that chapter 14? Just describing different portions of the brain. And this goes a little bit more maybe into some of the details of how they work. So the basal nuclei, again, we said are these kind of deeply embedded areas of gray matter. And they are going to influence some of the background patterns of movement. So again, you may think of it as those pathways we just talked about. When I made the conscious decision that I was going to write this on the board, right, those pathways are all starting to get involved. But there's also some underlying movements, right, just as I'm walking and moving around the classroom that are that are influenced, I should say, I suppose, by the basal nuclei. So what we're going to see here is that these neurons do not have direct control over the lower motor neurons, right? They're not going to tell the lower motor neurons, no, you're doing it wrong. What they do is they give feedback to those upper motor neurons that we saw embedded in the cortex and try to influence those upper motor neurons. So we'll just say they adjust the activity of upper motor neurons. Which kind of makes sense, right? We said those lower motor neurons, they're coming out on the spinal cord anyway. We don't really have a way to touch them, but they're, right, reaching out to the cerebral cortex to influence or adjust those upper neurons. Okay? Again, we think of this a lot as kind of patterns or rhythmic motions, things like walking. We talked again about how Parkinson's happens when some of these end up getting damaged or aren't getting the right feedback. Okay, our other somatic nervous system area that we should talk about, and again, both basal nuclei and the cerebellum are unconscious, right? They're not being fed by the cortex. But if we look at the cerebellum here, again, it affects upper motor neuron activity. Right? Does not directly control the lower motor neurons and instead is giving feedback to adjust the upper motor neurons. And again, with the cerebellum, what we think about here is the cerebellum was getting a lot of sensory information from those proprioceptors, right? Where are we in space? And basically we talk about the cerebellum as if it is comparing the desired movement, right? What the cortex said we should do, and then how that's actually working out, right? So it's comparing the feedback that it's getting there. So it compares the desired movement with the proprioceptive feedback that it's gotten through those sensory pathways, and then it's going to tell those upper motor neurons, hey, this is how you're doing, or this is what you should adjust to actually get where you wanted to be, right? So we definitely think about it coordinating the control of voluntary movement, but it's coordinating, right? It's not actually making the decisions. We see that very important in things like posture, or again, locomotion, things like walking, balance, etc.